Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another podcast of the Center for Asian American Christianity. My name is David Chao, and today I have the privilege of hosting a podcast with Marie Chan, a children's literature author of the 2024 book, Mamie Takes a Stand. You can see that beautiful book cover here. A Chinese American Girl's Fight for School Rights. Marie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Um, I want to talk about your book, but I also want to talk about the larger topic of storytelling within Asian American churches and how the practice of telling stories can provide context for healing. So we're going to dig into how the children's book layers into this broader theme, but I wanted to begin by saying you discovered a children's book about 1885 can unlock 2025 mental health conversations in Asian American churches. How did a historical story become a tool for healing contemporary trauma?
So it's interesting. This is not the journey that I thought I would be on, but God works in unconventional ways, and I think the thing that I have discovered through leading like book talks is that it's opening up these intergenerational conversations. And so, even though my book is initially for children, primarily upper elementary school students, I have grandparents buying the book for their grandchildren, right? Or my parents buying the book for their friends. And so this has led to like this catalyst to begin these conversations, and in some ways like indirectly, right, instead of going directly to say what is your story, somehow when these different generations see themselves reflected in one of the characters in the story, and then when we have these public book events and I'm sharing my research behind it, it almost like opens this door of like giving them public permission to share their story. It's almost as if my sharing my research process, because I did a lot of oral interviews of a lot of elderly Chinese Americans. And when they shared their histories with me, and that helped me give evidence to the book, it was like, it's almost like they're responding to that, saying, oh, yeah, that happened to me too. And I am adding evidence to your history that you're writing, right? So it's like this kind of inadvertent roundabout way. But in the process, they start sharing, oh, we experienced, or I experienced racial discrimination when we immigrated to this country, or different things, right? And that they may not have normally have just come out and said openly.
Oh, that's a beautiful image. I have in my mind how one sharing leads to another sharing, leads to another sharing. There's this chain of sharing, all of which is deeply personal. But they're connected through themes across people. And so these bonds get built that previously did not exist if the sharing did not start.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something good that happens in building relationships and community around this process of sharing stories.
Mm-hmm. And I think also it's a picture book, right? I mean, they don't have, right? We see how like first gen and second gen, they have um, difficulty sometimes in communication. There's loss of language. And even in these book talk responses, I get like, we were kind of felt forced to assimilate to survive. So we lost a lot of our native, our heart language, right? And so I talk a lot about that as well. But I think there's something where even if the grandparents aren't fluent in English, they can see the pictures, and there's something there too that's powerful. So it's an easier, more accessible entryway.
Marie, in your opening thoughts, you said a lot, and I want to unpack some of what you said. Let's just begin with a brief history lesson.
Mhm.
What happened in 1885? Because not everyone will know the story of Mamie Tape.
Mhm.
And I know you put so much research into this children's book. So there's no footnotes, but there is an appendix or appendices, which is where a lot of your historical work shows up. So set the stage historically. What happened in 1885?
Okay, so it's a year before, in about the fall of 1884.
Okay.
Mamie Tape tries to enter Spring Valley School in San Francisco. She was born in the United States in San Francisco, just not far from where the school was located. And she was denied entrance by the principal and later the whole Board of Education in San Francisco, the superintendent and everything, because she was of Chinese descent. Her parents, Joseph and Mary Tape, were immigrants from China. And even though she had grown up in that same neighborhood, literally like a block away from the school, I've gone on location. There's literally the school crossing sign is right in front of her house. Yeah, so that just shows you how close the school was, and yet she was denied entrance. And so her family takes her case all the way to the California Supreme Court. So actually, California Superior Court, and then it gets appealed by this Board of Education because she actually wins it in Superior Court, and then they appeal it, and she wins again in California Supreme Court.
What happened a couple years before all of this?
Oh, so this is about 2 to 3 years before the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So it's a very dangerous time.
After the Chinese
I'm sorry,
Exclusion Act.
after the Chinese Exclusion Act. Yeah, sorry. And she, yeah. So this was a very dangerous time for Chinese American families.
By situating this particular school board legal case in the wake of 1882 exclusion, it sort of personalizes to some degree some of these larger societal issues plaguing US society.
Mhm. Yes, and that's been the very interesting thing. I mean, sad but true of how history is repeating itself. And so when I started the research in 2020, this was like the rise in anti-Asian violence and like all the stuff surrounding COVID. And I was especially concerned about the elderly population getting attacked. And so it was very painful to be reading these articles in the archives from the late 1800s using the same kind of rhetoric of scapegoating and blaming Asians, and seeing that almost like mirrored again in 2020. And so it was, it made me feel so much more the importance of sharing this story that we can learn from history, but also as I was interviewing elderly Asian Americans, I thought it's very important for them to be able to know that their histories are important, to make sure they're seen, valued, heard, that their voices matter.
What happened after, just to close off the legal history here,
Mhm.
what happened after the appeal? Where did Mamie end up in school?
So her case is very complex. And I think we see this too, right? Like we see this with Brown versus Board of Education, where in 1954 you have this US Supreme Court victory. But 6 years later, in 1960, you have Ruby Bridges trying to integrate William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans and all this opposition against her, right? So you have this kind of thing where you can have a court victory, but the actual implementation is, yeah, another battle, right? And so I think with her, we see this court victory. They affirm that she is a citizen because she was born here. And so therefore she has the rights of birthright citizenship that are in the 14th Amendment. But then what happens is the school board, they're like, okay, now this is going to be a big problem. The courts have given her a victory. Uh, so they telegram like the state assembly and they obstruct justice. And I dug into the minutes of the state assembly meeting, and you can see when they're doing this assembly bill to amend the state law, saying that, yeah, you can have a right to a public education, but if there are separate schools, then you have to go to that one. And so here, in the assembly minutes, they're supposed to do certain rules and procedures in order to pass a bill. They bypass all that. It's in the minutes. And so you see, again, like this obstruction of justice. And we see that today, right? We're seeing some of these same things happening, unfortunately, in our country. But because of that, they quickly just haphazardly put together this Chinese school on the outskirts of Chinatown. And they're saying, okay, now you have to go there instead. You can have your public education, but you have to go to the segregated school. So that is the complexities of Mamie's story. And that was really hard for me to tell because like some people were like, oh, just end at the court victory. And I'm like, no, that's not the whole truth. You know, racism is very layered and complex. And yeah, so that was hard. How do you talk about that? Because we all want the happy ending, but how do you keep it hopeful? And so it's very interesting to me. But later on, when her family moves to Berkeley, her siblings do get to go to integrated schools. And interestingly enough, that school has been renamed Sylvia Mendez Elementary School. And that's a whole nother school integration case in Southern California, near where I live.
I want to give a shout out to our mutual friend and colleague, Anne Sue Kwong,
Oh, yes.
the children's book author, The House Before Falling into the Sea.
Mm,
Because so Anne was on our podcast as well, and her children's book is set within the context of the Korean War,
mm,
which is also another difficult episode. So here we have Marie Chan and Ansu Kwong dealing in children's literature with extremely lofty, complicated, and socially difficult topics. Go back to the authorial choice, the editorial choice you
mm,
made to not stop the story at the victory,
mm,
but to pursue it to the next chapter.
mm.
Say why that was important for you.
I think it's important for kids to know the whole truth. And I think racism is very complicated, and it's not like easily just resolved and you can tie it with a ribbon. And that's, like I said, with Ruby Bridges and the Brown case, right? It's not that neat and tidy. And it's an ongoing fight. There's a lot of layers. And so I wanted to be accurate too. Again, this is the Tapes family story, and I felt like it's important to tell the whole truth. And I think it's important to also start those conversations because what if sometimes you don't win, right? Like we have Gonglum versus Rice, which is a U.S. Supreme Court case that also involves Chinese Americans in education in the Deep South and in Mississippi, and here, that's not the most happy ending outcome. And so how do we become resilient through this process? How do we work through it when we don't necessarily get the initial victories we want? And I think that's important too, because you don't always win in the way you would like. And so it's just like kind of working out how do we live, and we might say we are given these certain rights, but is that our actual reality?
I want to take a step back into some of your own journey and vocational background. Were you pre-law in college? I know the answer, but I want you to share with the audience a little bit of how you got from, to how you got to become a children's author in this capacity, because you just cited a bunch of legal precedent. So one might think you went to law school or had an interest in the law.
Yeah, I mean, I did want to be a lawyer when I was younger, but then, yeah, that didn't really pan out for me. But I actually had a real love actually for the arts and for music. And so I actually ended up going to music school. And I think one class that really spoke to me, it was very interesting. We were very, I guess, blessed in the sense we had three professors for this very small class of maybe less than 40 students. And it was an art song class, actually. And we had a piano accompaniment teacher, professor, an English professor, and a music history professor. And I thought it was so interesting. And we would perform these different art songs or different poems, like whether it's by Emily Dickinson or Langston Hughes or different things, and set to music, and different composers setting poetry, different music. And I loved hearing the different perspectives of the professors, right? Like the literature professor would have a different perspective than the pianist or the historian. And so that's why I like to be more behind the scenes at being like accompanist or more of like on worship team, and that's why I went into music. But my last year of college, I took an education course, just an elective, and we were assigned to be like teacher aides in a local classroom. And I realized I really like being in the classroom working with students, and I can incorporate arts education in the schools. I'm very into integrating arts and just seeing cross curricular like connections. And so when I was in graduate school doing my master's in education, my professor in her children's literature class shared In the Year of the Born, Jackie Robinson by Betty Bow Lord. I don't know if you've read it. It's a small little chapter book. For students, probably elementary, upper elementary. And it was like one of the first ones that I had seen that had like a Chinese American girl as like the protagonist. And she's talking about there's this one scene that is so funny where she's immigrated from China. She doesn't speak English well. She sees like an American born Chinese on the playground. She's like, oh my goodness, somebody who looks like me, and that person doesn't speak any Chinese. And it's just like, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I get that. Like and I hadn't seen that until grad school. I'm like, where was this book when I was a child? And so I just saw the power of diverse books. And I was in, when I was teaching in Los Angeles, predominantly immigrant families from Mexico, and I tried to incorporate like diverse books, and I saw like the connections the kids made when they saw like their home language being represented and their families were represented. And so I knew that was something really important to see yourself reflected in literature. And so, but I never thought I'd be the one to the books. I always wanted to use them in curriculum and in teaching. But it wasn't until my daughter wanted me to read Separate is Never Equal by Duncan Tonatiuh in 2020 when COVID shut everything down. And I'm reading this book, and it's listing names like Garden Grove, Westminster, uh, and Santa Ana, like city names in Orange County where I grew up. And I'm like, how come I didn't know about separate Mexican, like American schools? Like I didn't know there were segregated schools in the county where I grew up. Literally, it was 1 mile, like about a mile away from where my family used to eat, like dim sum. Like this is where this case took place, and I didn't know that this was the precursor to Brown versus Board of Education, this Mendez et al. Versus Westminster et al. Case in 1947. And so that just led me on this rabbit trail of research. And that's when I found out about Mamie Tape and the Tape v. Hurley case, and realized this is even more personal because as a Chinese American, I would have been excluded from public education. And so, yeah, that's how my writing began. And I didn't see a biography yet written about Mamie Tape in a picture book form. And so I was like, this would be really good to do, just the way I learned about Sylvia Mendez through a picture book as an adult. And so I also saw that the bond, right, like intergenerationally, when you read it to your child, again, it can catalyze conversations, and I think it's accessible. I think parents don't have time to read, but they'll read a children's book to their child at bedtime, and that can be a way to begin discussions about these issues.
I love that journey. That journey actually makes a lot of sense given the process you went through. Already, we've heard that part of your desire, and this is from previous conversations you and I have had, part of your desire and love for music was in part related to worship at church. You grew up in a Chinese immigrant church. You are a person of Christian faith where your faith is quite important for you. I am I'm interested in sort of emotions, storytelling, the immigrant church you grew up in. Um, when you think back, because of stories and how stories is kind of like this key that opens things up. It opens people's hearts up and the memories they have, good or bad. And so, growing up in a Chinese immigrant church, what did you observe about how emotions and mental health issues and topics were handled in the community?
So, my experience is mixed. I would say overall, my observations are there is this focus on just survival, right? Like just perform well academically. Don't be the nail that sticks out that gets hammered down. Don't cause trouble, even if you see some injustice. But I feel like my family had some mental health challenges. And so I remember one of my mentors, and she also taught at our church, the children. She was studying like to get her doctorate in psychology, I think from Rosemead or Fuller or something like that. And she um, came. I remember I was in kindergarten. I remember her coming to talk to us about some of the challenges that my family was facing, and so that was kind of unique. I think I don't know if everybody would have that experience. We had access to somebody that was training to be a mental health professional when we were struggling with different things in our family. Also, there were different children in our Chinese congregation that were diagnosed with autism and Down syndrome. And I remember um, the families figuring out how to support those families with special needs. And then because of my family's struggle with mental health challenges, I think, gosh, was I in middle school? Yeah. So I remember that there was a friend who was having significant issues, and my parents actually um, took her in. Like she lived with us for a short time before she went into residential care. And I'm really thankful that friend is doing very well today. So that was a little bit unique. But I would say overall, a lot of parents are more like in the Asian churches that I saw were more dismissive of your emotions. It's kind of like we're going to meet your physical needs, but not really dive deep into how you're feeling. And you just work hard, keep going. I think there was a lot of comparison. There was a lot of striving for the American dream. Um, and so I think there's almost like an avoidant parenting style. And I think that caused, I think, a lot of harm for second gen. Even though they're not trying to, I mean, I'm not going to say they didn't love their children. It's just, I think there was a disconnect in understanding also the needs of second generation. I think second generation, where they're struggling with a lot of bicultural issues, being in the liminal space, but also it's hard to even converse, right? Like, because if your Chinese isn't that fluent anymore, and even that, okay, and I don't even want to go into dialects, right? Because, like, for my parents, yeah, like they can speak Mandarin, but is that really their heart language, or is it Taiwanese, or is it Hakka, or is it, some of our parents, they have other dialects, right? And so if we can't even, speak, how do we communicate at a deep level if we don't even know how to say that word in that dialect?
Wow, that's that's so helpful. Um, I want to set up a potential contrast. So you have sometimes avoidant tendencies within immigrant churches that are oriented towards survival. I understand that. And then you have in recent years, when you're doing book events surrounding Mamie Takes a Stand, you've noticed something different, especially with older generation Asian folks. You've mentioned to me in the past that these book events sometimes turn into spontaneous sharing sessions where people start talking about their own experiences. So just paint that picture for us. What exactly happens in these moments?
So for me, I think it has been really encouraging. I was invited to my parents' Bible study and tried to do my book talk in the best Mandarin that I could. And they were so positive in responding. And these are like aunties and uncles that have known me since I was a child, and they're in their like 70s, 80s, some might be even their early 90s. And it was just really neat to see that sharing this story, again, like I shared before, it almost gave voice, to give them permission to share their hurts, but also permission to stand up and speak up about things that had happened. Because I think in the past, right, they try to lay low and just work hard, and they didn't want to, uh, cause something that might cause them to not be able to be here, right, in this country. And I think felt safety, is really important, that I tried to create in these book talks, where I start again with the book. So, I'm really grateful for my editor. He's Asian American, and he really understood the heart of my story and the cultural nuances, especially about language, because he had lived in Taiwan for a while too. So it was he understood a lot of things. And so we had these deep conversations. I mean, we just read the book and we're like, oh, you just see it. But like this page, when Mamie Tape's mother writes this letter and it's published in the Daily Alta California, it's very significant because we deliberated, like, should we correct all her non-standard English grammar and spelling? Are people going to think like we didn't edit it correctly, right? And or is it going to cause disruption? It's going to be hard to read, like, interrupt the flow, and people might not understand. But in the end, we made the decision to keep it just the way she wrote it. And from my personal experience growing up, I remember being kind of like the interpreter, the translator for my parents, and being the one to advocate for them when they were in different situations, social situations, and couldn't speak as fluently as they would like. And so for me, I thought even this little editorial decision actually has great significance, because it's encouraging immigrants that when they see an injustice, that they should stand up and speak about it, even if their English isn't perfect or fluent. And that's something I've shared in my book talks. And I feel like it almost like opens again a door where the elderly are kind of like, okay, now I can share and I can relate to Mrs. Tape. She wanted the best education for her daughter. And she was in a time period, right, a Chinese Exclusion Act that was very volatile and dangerous, and yet she still spoke up. And so I think they kind of they'll kind of like talk to me too afterwards, like, when I was in the workplace, I was discriminated against, or or I will share, I do a lot of I did a lot of extensive research on dialects, right? So there's Toisanese, Hoisanhua, there's Cantonese, there's Mandarin, there's different dialects that I want to show because I think it's important to highlight these minority, like, heritage languages, dialects, to show even being Chinese is not a monolith. But I also see how heart language, those early dialects, sometimes, right, those have diminished because of different reasons, like, and so I wanted to really bring that out too, because I see, like, even my parents, they connect more to, like, their friends that are Hakka. Like, it's not even just like Chinese, but there's that language, right, is really important. So I shared how I had to talk to interview some elderly people, one of them from my previous church, Chinese church, that she spoke Huisanhua. And so I thought that was interesting when I was interviewing her, and she was telling me the complexities of Toisanese. She started talking about, my family, we were separated because of the Exclusion Act, and and then she starts telling me her whole, like, right, it went from talking about, like, this dialect to talking about, gosh, the pain of being separated from my siblings, or this or that, and the choices my parents had to make when they immigrated to, to the US. And I was like, interesting, like, it just led to so many more things. And so I'm discovering, like, I don't know if they've had the luxury till now, like after retirement, to really have the chance to share their oral histories. And I don't know if second gen has really had the time to listen to them. So it's interesting too. I feel like grandchildren can play a role. Third gen can really play a role in like talking to their grandparents, and bringing that out. Uh, and it's interesting to me too. I know that I was interviewing my father-in-law about his oral history, and I mean, I could see like he was still like processing certain different emotionals from decades ago. And my husband says, Marie, my dad has never told me any of that stuff. Like, how come he's telling it to you? And I said, I think I'm just one of the few people that just sat down and was willing to listen. And so I think it's it's not a replacement for therapy, but I think it can be a start, especially when this population of elderly Asian Americans, they may not seek out mental health services as easily, but it can start conversations.
So, Marie, not only have you completed this fantastic book, you're working on your next book.
Mhm.
And I think you mentioned to me in the past that it's a graphic novel. Share with us a little bit of what this next book is going to be about and what inspired you to tackle it in the form of a graphic novel.
Well, I love pictures. I think visual storytelling is so important and it's so accessible, right? I think uh, the way pictures and text work together, it really engages readers so much more. And so I see graphic novels being some of the most popular things that are checked out at the library by young people. And it can also be read um, more quickly than like an academic book. And so I think graphic novel also is good because it's a longer form, right? A picture book it has fewer pages, so you can't dive quite as deeply into different themes. And also, it could have the potential to be a series, but for me, my heart goes out to Asian American youth. And I'm going back to my childhood and seeing, I mean, I have these pictures in my mind of being in these spaces where some of the things we've been discussing about actually came into play, right? Like where I'm like in high school with some of my good friends and their parents are leaders in the church, and yet their parents are like doing things that I think are really affecting their um, emotional well-being, right? Saying things like, why can't you be more like so and so who's has more academic achievements? And I'm just standing there going, and thinking like to myself, like, wait a second, like, is this biblical? I don't think this is biblical, but these are like Sunday school teachers too, and deacons and her pastors, and just feeling like, wait, I don't somehow there's this, their history is like meshing with how they're parenting, and then just seeing like how devastating that was to my friends and being like, how can I go back there but like begin these conversations to bring healing? Because um I think there's more to it why those parents said those things too, right? Their own pressures, right? Like, oh, we had to sell the family farm in order for me to come here for grad school or whatever it was. Or, they have their own War II stories or different things. And they're kind of like living vicariously through their children. And they also have a lot of pressure maybe to prove themselves. Like it was worth it for their family to sacrifice for them to come to the US and things like that. And so then that pressure is kind of carried over to the next generation. But then at the same time, they discover faith in Christ and they're kind of growing as believers too, but not quite mature yet, and trying to, and so all this kind of gets again kind of tangled, and so it's kind of like parsing through that. And then for us as second generation, thinking, wait, you're telling us to go to church, read the Bible, but then Jesus says this about justice, Jesus says this about loving your neighbor. Jesus says like our value and worth don't come from like necessarily those achievements, right? And so like how do we like parse through all that? And so it's kind of all those different themes to discuss, because I feel like there's been some great graphic novels out there about like being bicultural, like Asian American, and maybe they'll touch a little bit of like we went to church or something like that or prayed, but I really want it to be focused on the faith component where there's this striving for the American dream, but then there's this disconnect with like how faith and biblical Christian, all that, is involved. And so just kind of exploring that, but also maybe doing some flashback too, right? Again, when we're talking about what's the need behind the behavior, what's the history of our own history that's affecting our present. So
I'm getting goosebumps. Your graphic novel. That sounds like such a cool book. Oh my goodness. So this graphic novel is going to be like Christian?
I want to focus on that because there like that disconnect between striving for the American dream and these church, Asian American church, these Christian families, right? And these youth struggling. I mean, I think about myself when I wanted to do missions in Africa, my parents were like, no, that's not safe. And I'm like, but we go to all these mission conferences at church and I was talking about Great Commission. And then when I actually want to like go to like the slums of Africa, you're like, no. And I'm like, but Jesus like loves the Lord. So.
Do you have a working title for this graphic novel?
I do actually. Diaspora Dreams.
Wow, I'm really excited, Marie, for this graphic novel. More power to you. I think we need to hear these stories of intergenerational pressure points, the joys and the pains, especially from a Christian faith perspective. Speaking about Christian faith and our faith leaders, especially Asian American pastors, staff workers, etc., what wisdom might you share about storytelling that can bring healing? So, um, I'm thinking especially about your trauma informed background and how that helps you to frame stories that powerfully release and make trust happen and connection happen and relational healing. Say more about the potential for storytelling in the church, especially the Asian American church.
I want to start with actually focusing on a group that I think tends to get overlooked, which would be transracial adoptees. Uh, for me, that's funny thing is my son, right, because we adopted from Taiwan and my husband and I are of, right, like Taiwanese descent, uh, my son doesn't have quite the same experiences. He actually has to convince other people that he's adopted because people won't believe him. Um, but talking to the majority of like Chinese like adoptees, like their experience is different. And that kind of opened my eyes to the need also for addressing some of their mental health concerns. I didn't know this, that like sometimes transracially adopted Chinese adoptees, they don't feel connected to American born Chinese. And I thought, because I know talking to fellow ABCs, we're always like, oh yeah, like, we're used to like kind of code switching or, being in this bicultural space. But they're like, I don't necessarily connect to that either because I grew up in a white family. And I'm like, huh, that's interesting. So they have this Chinese face, but they can't, they don't even feel like they belong necessarily in uh like second gen, like American born Chinese spaces either. And so I was like, wow, that's really isolating, right? And so I think that's something that I would like, I think, Asian American churches to address more. And it was interesting. Again, I was sharing, this is a different manuscript, is about grief and loss, but it featured Chinese American protagonist. And I remember a transracial Chinese adoptee came up to me afterwards when I shared it. And she said, like, she really connected to it. But she also, when she met me, she said, I don't think I've met anyone Asian who adopted someone Asian. And so that like meant a lot to her. And I thought that was interesting as well. So I think just sharing um, stories and being vulnerable. I think we had right like post 1965, right? A lot of those like because of immigration law, right? We have mostly like a lot of scholars that immigrated to the US. And so I think oftentimes Asian churches tend to have this kind of academic approach to Bible study. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's good to have that kind of robust study of the Bible. But I think we also miss out on what is like authentic small group sharing, if that makes sense, where we can really be vulnerable with each other. Because I think when you keep things very cerebral, you can kind of separate yourself, kind of not really show your true self, not really deal with your own real history. So I think for ministry leaders, being vulnerable to share, begin to share your own stories or creating safe spaces for people in a group setting to share is really important. And sometimes that's hard, right? Like if you get a bunch like my parents' friends and say, okay, we're going to do like everyone share directly about your experience with racism in this country, they're not going to probably share um, or, but like if you say, hey, will you read this with your grandchild? And then there's discussion questions and then share a little about your immigration experience, maybe that's a little bit easier, like to kind of do this more indirect way. Do you feel like you can relate to Mamie's story? Do you see yourself in that, or did you have a similar experience when you first came to this country?
I think that's a very fitting note to conclude
Mhm.
this podcast.
Mhm.
I want to thank you, Marie, for sharing, for one, publishing this book, Mamie Takes a Stand. And we're going to put a link in our show notes for people to check out the book along with your social media for folks to follow you. Thank you, Marie, for this talk.
Oh, you're welcome. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.